Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Ayin, Daf 70 of Masechta Pesachim. Yeah, it's a good daf. It's mostly not too complicated. At the bottom of the first Amud, it gets a little bit, I don't know, Gemara-y, I guess, but nothing too intense. And we talk about the Chagigas Yudalad, which is an interesting thing. What this Chagigas Yudalad is. Basically, the Korban Pesach, you would eat it like as dessert, right? It was ala sova. You would already be satisfied. So, what's the main course? Well, the answer is the main course is the Chagigas Yudalit. That with the Korban Pesach, you would also bring this special kind of hagiga. Now, there's a different hagiga, which is the Shalmei hagiga, which you bring at every festival. That's what's called the Chagigas Tesvav. That's the Chagiga that you bring on the first day of Pesach, or also, and you could really bring it through on any day of Pesach. You have the entire Pesach to bring the Shalmei Chagiga. The same thing applies to Sukkot. You could bring it all of Sukkot. And interestingly, when it comes to Shavuos is only one day, but you can nonetheless make up the Shalmei Chagiga for the 6 days following Shavuos as well, which is why we actually don't say Tachanun following Shavuos for 6 days, because you could do Tashlumin during all those 6 days. So that's sort of the regular Shalmei Chagiga. However, there's a special Chagigas Yudalid, a special Korban Shlamim that you would bring on the 14th day of Pesach, in addition to the Korban Pesach. No, on the 14th day of Nisan, in addition to the Korban Pesach, and that would be kind of the main meal. But that would only really be brought if you actually needed it. Let's say you didn't have so many people in your group that you were eating Korban Pesach with, so then you might not necessarily need to bring a Korban Chagiga if nobody's going to eat it. So this is this interesting Chagiga that we will be discussing today. So we're going to start from the Mishnah on Samach Tes Amud Beis, about 7 lines from the bottom. Eimose mevi Chagiga imo. So when do you bring a Chagigas Yudalid with the Korban Pesach? Bizman Shuba B'chol. Okay, so first of all, you're only going to bring a Chagiga with the Korban Pesach if it's during the week. It's not going to be Docha Shabbos. B'tahara, also only if you're tahor. So for example, if the majority of Am Yisrael is tameh and they bring a Korban Pesach B'tuma, so you will not bring a Chagiga with it. That is not brought B'tuma. V'muat, and also if there won't be enough meat. It's funny, you have to kind of think twice when you do this. Meaning, muat doesn't mean when it's a small group. It's dafka the opposite. When you have a very large group, and therefore the Korban Pesach won't be enough, so then you bring a Korban Chagiga, Chagigas Yudalad, to supplement the meat of the Korban Pesach, so that you will be able to eat the Shalmei Chagiga and then have the Korban Pesach sort of ala sova once you're already satisfied. Uvizman Shuba b'Shabbos. But if the 14th day of Pesach, no, I feel like I keep on saying that. If the 14th day of Nisan is Shabbos, or b'Meruba, if there are very little people in the group and therefore there's the Korban Pesach is enough, Uvituma, or if Am Yisrael is tameh, ein mevini mo chagiga, so then you will not bring the Chagigas Yudalid that year. Chagiga ha'isabaa min hatzon, min ha'bakar, min ha'kvasum, min ha'izim. So the Korban Chagiga can be brought, this Chagigas Yudalid can be offered from tzon, sheep and stuff, min ha'bakar, or even cattle, right? Even cows and stuff, because it's not a Korban Pesach, it's a Korban Shlamim. Min ha'kvasim, min ha'izim, from sheep, from goats. Min ha'zchom, min ha'kevos, whether male, female, because the Korban Pesach is davka male. And also you can eat it for 2 days and the night in between. Interesting stuff, right? Right, let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, my Tana de Katani Chagiga. So the Gemara wants to know, how come all of a sudden we're talking about the Korban Chagiga? Like what prompted, what preempted, what inspired the sudden discussion regarding Korban Chagiga? So Tanar Kavasav Avasu Delodachi Shabbos. So the Gemara answers, well, in the previous Mishnah we talked about the fact that carrying the animal on your shoulder or bringing it from outside of the Tchum Shabbos are not Docha Shabbos. So Vikatani Nami Chagiga Delodachi Shabbos. So we also mentioned the Chagigas Yudalid that it is also not Docha Shabbos Vachikamar, and this is what the Mishnayos are saying. When do you bring together with the Korban Pesach a Korban Hagiga? That would be if it comes during the week when everybody is tahor and when there would not be enough meat of the Korban Pesach, so you need to supplement it with the Korban Hagiga. Amr of Ashi Shma Mina, says of Ashi, so we see from here that Chagigas Arba Aser Lo Chovahi. So we see that bringing the Chagigas Yudalid, this Chagiga that you bring the Korban Pesach, is not an obligation. The Sagadate Chovahi, because if it was an obligation, well then Teisi B'Shabbos, well then it should be Docha Shabbos. V'Teisi B'Meruba. Or even if there was plenty of meat for the Korban Pesach, it was a small group, and the Korban Pesach would be plenty of meat, you would still have to bring the Chagigas Yudalid if it was an obligation. V'Teisi B'Tuma. Or if majority of Am Yisrael is Tameh, you should still have to bring the Korban Chagiga. Right? So from the fact that you don't bring the Chagigas Yudalid in any of those contexts, so clearly it is not an obligation to bring one. It is just there if, it's a large group and you need supplemental meat so that the Korban Pesach can be eaten once you are already full. When there are a lot of people in the group, how come you bring a Chagigas Yudalid? Kedetanya, as we learn in the Brisa, Chagiga Aba'im Pesach Necheles Tchila, that the Korban Chagiga that is brought with the Korban Pesach, the Chagiga is eaten first, Kadesh Pesach Nechel Halasova, so that the Korban Pesach can be eaten once you are already full, and in this case that would be you're full because you ate the meat of the Korban Chagiga. Very interesting. We say that the Chagigas Yudalid can be eaten for 2 days and the day in between, like a shlamim, and the night in between. 2 days and the night in between. So says the Gemara, well, clearly then, this Mishnah is not like Ben Tema. How come? The Tanya, well, we learn in the Brisa. Ben Tema Omer, Chagiga Ba'oim Pesach, Harei Pesach. Well, because Ben Tema's opinion is that the Korban Chagiga that comes on the 14th day of Nisan with the Korban Pesach is like the Korban Pesach. And it is only eaten for 1 day and 1 night, not the following day, just like the Korban Pesach. However, as I mentioned, the regular Korban Chagiga, the Chagigas Yudalid is a special kind of Korban Chagiga, but the regular Shalmei Chagiga can be eaten for 2 days and the night in between, like a regular Shlomim. Now, in addition to the Shalmei Chagiga, there's also Shalmei Simcha. You also bring V'samachta b'chagecha, be happy. How can you be happy? You eat meat. Alright, sounds good to me. So, the Korban, what do we say? Chagigas Arba Asr, if you did not end up offering it, so you set it aside to be your Chagigas Yudalid, you did not end up offering it, well then, on the next day, on the 15th, well, you can slaughter it as your Shalmei Chagiga. I believe it's saying on the 15th. Meaning, I assume if it's Yom Tif, you should be able, I think that you can check the Shalmei Chagiga, the Shalmei Simcha on Yom Tif, why not? Okay, and if not, the first day of Yom Tif, so then, Chol Hamoed, but I think you could check even on Yom Tif, but anyways, so if you have this animal that you set aside to be your Chagigas Yud Daled, you didn't end up shechting it, okay? Yeah, I believe, what does it say? Im ikva ad l'machar. Yeah, that's what Rashi says, so the machar would be the 15th, i.e. the first day of Yom Tif. So, if he didn't end up shechting this Chagigas Yudalid, so you can offer it as shalmei simcha, a shlomim that you offer just to be happy on Yom Tiv. Mishum hagiga, but you cannot use it for the korban hagiga, because generally any korban that is an obligation to bring, you cannot bring it. It has to come from chulin, right? So the shalmei hagiga, which is an obligation to bring, so since you had already set aside this korban to be the hagigas yudalad, so you wouldn't be able to use it for the regular hagiga. However, shalmei simcha, we learn out that you actually, it actually does not have to be chulin, so you can use this animal that you set aside to be your hagigas yudalad. If you didn't end up using it for hagigas yudalad, you could still use it for shalmei simcha. Okay, sounds good to me. My time with Ben Tema, no? How come Ben Tema decided that the hagigas yudalad is just like the korban pesach and can only be eaten for basically that night? So Kedamasni Rav L'chia Brei. Well, it's like Rav taught to his son Chia, that you may not leave over to the morning the offering of the chag of Pesach. So zevach chag is a chagiga, that when the pasuk says zevach chag, so that's referring to chagiga, and a pasach kimashmo, and the Pesach is obviously referring to korban Pesach, and the pasuk is saying do not leave it over. So what we're learning from there is that just like the korban Pesach you don't leave over to the morning, also the hagigas yudalad you don't leave it over until the morning. That is why Ben Tema says his opinion that the hagigas yudalad is like the korban Pesach. Now, Yibarlu, they want to know, Liven Tema necheles tzoli or necheles tzoli. So how far does this comparison of the hagigas yudalad to the korban Pesach, how far does that go? Does it extend also to the fact, well, korban Pesach, as we learned, probably a while ago already, needs to be roasted. Does the hagigas yudalad have to be roasted? So ki akshi achmona lefesach lelino avalatzali lo. Do we say that when we compare the shalmei chagiga, the hagigas yudalad to the korban Pesach, it is specifically regarding the fact that you can't leave it over to the morning? Avalatzali lo, but it wouldn't go so far as to say that you also have to roast specifically the hagigas yudalad. O dilma lo shna, or maybe it doesn't matter. We compare it in all ways to the korban Pesach, and therefore you would have to roast the chagigas yudalad. Tashma, kominir, laila azeh kulo tzali. So we have a Mishnah that comes up later on that says that this night, the first night of Pesach, is entirely roasted. It says Rashi, masnisni beperek baso kulo tzali v'afilo achagiga. Right? That the Mishnah says that the entire everything that night, everything on Seder night is roasted, even the chagigas yudalad has to be roasted. It says of Chizda that this is specifically Ben Tema's opinion. So what do we see? So we see that Ben Tema's opinion is that just like the korban Pesach needs to be roasted, the hagigas yudalad also needs to be roasted. Okay, fine. Now we ask another question regarding just how far does Ben Tema take the comparison. Ibarlu, they want to know the Ben Tema ba'amin abakar or in a ba'amin abakar. Can, according to Ben Tema, can the hagigas yudalad be a cow? Ba'amin anakevos or in a ba'amin anakevos. Can it be female? Ba'abas shtei shanim or in a ba'abas shtei shanim. Can it be more than a year old? Right? These are all things that would be puzzle by a korban Pesach. But what about by hagigas yudalad? Ki akshu achmona lepesach lemidi da achila aval chomile lo. Do we say that when we compare the hagigas yudalad to the korban Pesach, that's regarding things related to eating it, such as having to roast it or having to eat it before the morning, but not necessarily everything, not necessarily the fact that it has to be male or, less than a year old. Maybe we wouldn't extend it that far, or maybe we extend it completely. Tashma, come in here. Chagiga abo'im Pesach, arei ke Pesach. Well, come in here, it says that the korban chagiga that comes with the korban Pesach on the 14th arei ke Pesach, it is like the Korban Pesach. What does that mean? Ba'al min hatzon, ve'ena ba'al min habakar. It's got to be sheep. It can't be cows. Ba'al min hazcharim, ve'ena ba'al min hanekeves. It's got to be male. Can't be female. Ba'al bas shnosa, ve'ena ba'al bas shtei shonim. It's got to be within its first year. Can't be within the first 2 years. Can't be, more than a year old. Ve'ena necheles elul yom v'layla. It can only be eaten for basically until the next morning. Ve'ena necheles elul tzali. It's got to be roasted. Ve'ena necheles elul mnuyov. And it's only for the group that is assigned to it. So who's the one who holds all these things? Who's the one that we know holds that it's got to be roasted, that you can only eat it until the morning? That's Ben Tema. And we're saying Shmamina Kulu Milsa Ba'inan Shmamina, and we're saying that what? That it's really compared, that the hagiga is compared to the Korban Pesach in all ways. Okay, fine. Sounds good to me. Yeah, the Saturday night ones, man, I always get tired. Well, it's hard. It's late, man. It's like 8 o'clock already. I've been up since like freaking 3 in the morning. Alright. Oh, man. Alright. Weiter. Ibailu, fragt die Gemara. Die Gemara ist Akash. Leventema yeshba mishum shveretz etzem o enba mishum shveretz etzem. Another question. How far does Bentema take this comparison? We got one more question. Breaking the bones. A Korban Pesach, you're not allowed to break the bones. The pasuk says, "Ve'etzem lo sishbruvo." Do not break the bones of the Korban Pesach. So does that extend to the Chagigas Yudalit? And this little bit is going to get just a touch complicated, but no, I wouldn't say necessarily too much more than a touch. So do we say that even though, yes, we have a pretty, we were pretty like tight comparison between the Chagigas Yudalit and the Korban Pesach, as we've said up until now, it's basically the same conditions. But when it comes to breaking bones, it says bo. It says etzem lo sishbru bo. So bo v'lo b'chagiga. Maybe I'll say what it means is don't break the bones of a Korban Pesach, but you can break the bones of a Korban Chagiga. Odilma hai bo b'kasher v'lo b'pasul de'asa. Or maybe when the pasuk says etzem lo sishbru bo, it means in a kosher one, not a pasul one. But it could theoretically apply to the Korban Chagiga as well. Okay, fine. Let's see. Toshma, come in here. Sakin shenimtzeis ba'arba aser shochit ba'miyad. Okay, so if you find a knife on the 14th day of Nisan, so you can use it immediately to shechter Korban Pesach, meaning you don't have to be concerned that maybe it's tamei and you have to bring it to the mikvah. No, if you found it on the 14th day of Nisan, you can assume that whoever lost it, mistame already put it in the mikvah because they were going to have to use it for their Korban Pesach. So you can assume that it's already been toveled and it's tahor, and you can use it to shechter Korban Pesach. B'shlosha also shona umatbil. However, if you find a knife on the 13th day of Nisan, well then you gotta put it in the mikvah, because even if the owner of this knife, the original owner who lost the knife, was planning to use it to shechter Korban Pesach, he may not have put it in the mikvah yet, because it's only the 13th of Nisan. Maybe he was planning to get to it later that day. But if you found it on the 14th, you can assume that already the day before, on the 13th, the owner had put it in the mikvah. Now, kupitz, but what about this like big knife? A knife that's so big and strong that you can use it to break bones. So, bein bazeh or vein bazeh shona umatbil. And we say that whether you find this kupitz on the 13th, whether you find the kupitz on the 14th, you have to put it in the mikvah. So why would you have to put it in the mikvah if you're planning to use it? So the answer is because we have no reason to assume that the owner, the original owner of this kupitz, put it in the mikvah, because why should he? Generally, you wouldn't use it to do shchita. You can, but generally it's more for breaking bones. And what bones are you going to break? You're not breaking the Korban Pesach, right? It says, Vetzim lo tishbu, you're not going to be breaking the bones of the Korban Pesach. And we seem to be assuming that you're also not going to be breaking the bones of the Chagigas Yudalit. So there's basically no reason to assume that the original owner of the knife put it in the mikvah. And we seem to be saying also that in the Chagigas Yudalit, you're not allowed to break the bones. Because if you could break the bones, then we should be able to assume that this kupitz was already put in the mikvah because the owner of the korban, because the owner of the kupitz would have been planning to use it to break the bones of the Chagigas Yudalit. But since we seem to be saying that we cannot assume that the kupitz was in the mikvah, then mistama, the point is, well, because there was no need, because you're not allowed to break the bones of the Chagigas Yudalit. So money. So who would be the author of this price? So who would be the one to say that theoretically you should be unable to break the bones of the Chagigas Yudalit? Ilema Rabbanon, if it's the rabbis, well, Maishna Sakin Dematbil, the Chazi le Pesach, Kupitznami, Chazi le Chagiga. Now, if it's the Rabbanon, it wouldn't really make sense, because according to the rabbis, they're not comparing the Chagigas Yudalit to the Korban Pesach, right? They say, just as one example, that you can eat it for 2 days, right? The Korban Pesach, you can only eat until the next morning, right? Meaning, they don't make this comparison between the Chagigas Yudalit and the Korban Pesach, and therefore, obviously, you should be able to break the bones of the Chagigas Yudalit. Why not? And therefore, what's the difference between the knife? What's the difference between the kupitz? You're going to use both of them. The knife will use for shechita. The kupitz will use to break the bones of the shamei of the Chagigas Yudalit. Rather, it can only make sense if you say that it's Bentema, who generally compares the Chagigas Yudalit to the Korban Pesach. And we're seeing from this brisa that he must be the author, and he's saying that you're also unable to break the bones of the Chagigas Yudalit, and therefore, if you find a kupitz on the 14th day or 13th day of Nisan at any time, you cannot assume that it's tahor, because why would the owner have put it in the mikvah? It's not like he's going to be breaking the bones of the Pesach or the Chagiga. And we see that Bentema extends the comparison of Korban Pesach and Chagiga to even include the prohibition against breaking the bones of the Chagigas Yudalit. Lo Olam Rabbanon. Really, it is the rabbis. Well, if it's the rabbis, well then why? You should be able to assume that the kupitz is tahor, because you're going to want to use it to break the bones of the Chagigas Yudalit. Well, it's talking about where the 14th day of Nisan was a Shabbos, and as we said, you don't bring the Chagigas Yudalit on Shabbos. Okay? So therefore, since you're not bringing the Chagiga, there would really have been no reason for the owner to have put the kupitz in the mikvah, because you're not bringing the Chagiga, and therefore you're not going to need it to be breaking any bones. But frek the Gemara, in the Seifa, at the end of that brisa, it says, that if the 14th day of Nisan falls out on Shabbos, shoched ba miyad, you would be able to use the kupitz. Because you're going to need it for Yom Tov afterwards, right? Because since Yom Tov is coming up right after Shabbos, so you're going to be able to break the bones of whatever animals you're eating on Yom Tov, and therefore you would have already put the kupitz in the mikvah before Shabbos. Same thing applies that if you find the kupitz on the 15th day of Nisan, you can use it immediately, because the owners would have already put it in the mikvah from the day before, so that they would be able to use it on Yom Tov. So nimtzeis kupitz kshur l'sakin, if you find a kupitz that was tied to a sakin, also harei kesakin, you can treat it like the sakin, i.e., just like you can assume that the knife was already put in the mikvah. You can assume the same about the kupitz. So, from the fact that we say at the end of the brisa that, well, if the 14th falls out on Shabbos, well, then clearly the first part, as the Gemara says, Michal Dereisha, Lav B'Shabbos Askinon, which means that the first part is not talking about Shabbos. Okay, so if the first part is not talking about Shabbos, well then I should be able to assume that the kupitz is tahor, because according to if it's according to the Chachamim, so I should be able to use it to break the bones of my hagiga Yudalit. So ve'ela sheba b'meruba. So Gemara says, well, it's talking about a situation where it was a small group, and therefore there was plenty of meat to go around, and therefore the owner didn't have to bring a hagigas yudal to supplement the meat of the Korban Pesach, and therefore, since there was going to be no hagiga, the owner didn't put the knife in the mikveh, put the kupitz in the mikveh, because there was no hagiga to be breaking the bones of. But minayade, how did the owners know that there was going to be a small group, right? Until he shechs the Korban Pesach, people can come and go, and therefore maybe it was going to end up being last minute a lot of people, and therefore they were going to have to bring a chagiga, and therefore, he has no way of knowing. So mistama, from the day before, he would have put the kupitz in the mikveh, because just in case a lot more people sign up, then he's going to want to bring a chagiga yudalid, and then he'll need the knife to break the bones, according to the chachamim. So vela sheba betuma. Okay, well, it's talking about where the Korban Pesach was going to be brought betuma. And therefore, if we said if the Korban Pesach was going to be brought betuma, so then what? If the Korban Pesach is brought betuma, so then you don't bring the Korban Chagiga. Since you're not bringing the Korban Chagiga, so then you don't need to be breaking any bones. That's why I didn't put it in the mikveh. But sof minayade. How do they know that there was that the next day the Korban Pesach was going to be brought betuma and there's not going to be a chagiga? The misnasi. Well, because the nasi died, and therefore, since the nasi died, was that the king? I think. Since the king died, so then everybody has a mitzvah to be involved in the burial, and therefore all of Am Yisrael was going to be tamei, and therefore they weren't going to bring a chagiga. But the mis nasi emas. When did the nasi die? If he died on the 13th, well then, sakin lomli dematbele. Well then, why would he have why are we assuming that he would have put the knife in the mikveh? I mean, he's going to be tummy anyways. Why should he put the knife in the mikveh? Okay, so it's talking about where he died on the 14th. But, okay, if he died on the 14th, and therefore the day before on the 13th, you didn't yet know that he was going to die, well then, ma'ishna sakin matbil, ma'ishna kupitz lo matbil, la, right? But if he died on the 14th, but on the 13th, the day before, when he was going to be putting the knives and things in the mikveh, well, why would he have only put the knife in the mikveh? He should have also put the kupitz in the mikveh, because just like he didn't know at the time that the following day was going to be bringing a Korban Pesach betuma, so therefore he put the knife in the mikveh, well then he may as well have put also the kupitz in the mikveh, because he should have assumed that he was going to be bringing a chagiga as well, and he's going to want to break the bones. So tzricha denasi goes his b'shlosha aser. Well, it's talking about where the nasi on the 13th, he was like kind of not looking good, like he was probably going to die, and then he actually died on the 14th, and therefore on the 13th, when things weren't looking good for the nasi, and the owner of this knife that got lost, or the kupitz that got lost, had to start thinking like, all right, what am I going to put in the mikveh? Well, sakin dechad sveka matbila. Well, the knife where there's only really one suffix, which is, well, if the nasi dies, well then we're going to just be bringing the Korban Pesach betuma, and I don't necessarily have to put it in the mikveh. But if he doesn't die and he stays alive, well then there's not going to be any tuma, and I'm going to need to use this knife, and it's going to be tamei. So let me put it in the mikveh, right? Since it's only one suffix, if the nasi dies, then there wouldn't be any point of putting it in the mikveh. But if he stays alive, well then I'm going to need a tahor knife, so you're going to put it in the mikveh. But kupitz, the tres veke lo matbila. But the kupitz, there's an additional suffix, right? There's the one suffix of, well, if the nasi dies, well, then I'm not going to be bringing the Korban Chagiga, so I don't really need to put it in the mikveh. But if he doesn't die, I'm going to need a tahor knife. But then there's the additional of one, but even even if the Nasi doesn't die and there's not going to be a Korban B'tumah, but what if not so many people come to my Korban Pesach? Well, then I'm not going to have to bring a hagiga anyway. So since there's the double concern, therefore he might not end up putting it in the mikvah. So therefore, you can theoretically say that this brisa, where we say that if you find a knife, you can assume that it went to the mikvah, but if you found a kupitz, so then you cannot assume that it went to the mikvah. You can actually say that it technically is the Chachamim's opinion, and even though the Chacham said we do not compare hagiga of Yudalid to the Korban Pesach, and therefore you should be able to break the bones of the hagiga, nonetheless, you cannot assume that the owner of the kupitz actually did put it in the mikvah for that reason, because it's talking about where the Nasi was a goses, means he was kind of about to die on the 13th, and they didn't know if he was going to die or not, and therefore the knife he put in the mikvah because maybe he was going to need it if the Nasi stays alive, but the kupitz is the too many suffix. Alright, so I guess it doesn't necessarily prove anything regarding bentema and if he extends it to bones. Sounds good to me. Alright, so that was the a little bit of a complicated part, but then we continue with the not so complicated stuff. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Yehuda ben Dortai, Peiresh, Huva Dortai Beno. Interesting. So Yehuda ben Dortai, he decided that he was going to move away from the establishment. He and his son Dortai. And he went and he settled in the south of Israel. Omar, he said, if Elijah the prophet comes, and he says to the Yidden, how come you didn't offer the Korban Chagiga on Shabbos? What would they say to Eliyahu Navi? Meaning, clearly, Yehuda ben Dortai was very upset about the fact that the Chacham were saying that the Chagigas Yudalid is not Docha Shabbos. He felt that the Chagigas Yudalid should be Docha Shabbos. Tamo'ani, says Yehuda ben Dortai, I do not understand. I'm very surprised. Al Shnei Gedolei Ador Shmaya v'Avtalyon, on the two Gedolei Ador, the two leaders of the generation, the Zugis, Shmaya and Avtalyon, Shein Chacham Gedolim, that they're big Chachamim, V'darshanin Gedolim, and they really know how to expound the Torah. And for some reason, Yehuda ben Dortai could not understand why Shmaya and Avtalyon did not instruct the Yidden to offer the Chagigas Yudalid on Shabbos. Amar Rav, my time with the ben Dortai. Says Rav, how come ben Dortai assumes that the Chagigas Yudalid should be Docha Shabbos? Tichsiv, because the Pasuk says, V'zavachta Pesach Hashem Elokecha tzon uvaker, that you will offer the Korban. So that motorcycle. That you'll offer the Korban Pesach to the Eibishter your God, tzon uvaker, that the Korban Pesach will be sheep, but also cows. What do you mean that you're going to bring a Korban Pesach of a cow? Korban Pesach has to be sheep or goats. Therefore, no. So he learns out that when it says tzon, it's referring to the Korban Pesach, but bakar is taka, a reference to the hagiga of Amrachman of Zavachta Pesach, and the pasuk says that you will offer it as a Pesach, meaning that we're comparing the hagiga to the Korban Pesach, and he wants to argue that just like the Korban Pesach is Docha Shabbos, also the Chagigas Yudalid should be Docha Shabbos. Amr Vashi, one in time the Furushim Neku V'Nifrosh. So says Ravashi, since when should we give any attention to this fellow who decided he was going to be separate from everybody else and move away to some other place? Just because of this Yehuda ben Dortai, we have to find proofs for him in the Torah. Rather, the pasuk is needed for like Rav Nachman teaches. What does he say? How do I know that if you have a Korban Pesach that you did not end up using for a Korban Pesach for whatever reason? So how do I know that you could afterwards use it as a Korban Shlamim? that you will offer a Korban Pesach to Hashem your God, sheep and cows. What do you mean? I thought only a Pesach doesn't come from cows, only from sheep and goats. Rather, what it's saying is that if you have a Korban Pesach that wasn't actually used as a Korban Pesach, and now it's left over, so you can use it as a Korban that can come from Tzonu Bakar, meaning a Shlamim, you could offer sheep, you can offer cows as Shlamim, and therefore what it's saying is that if you have a Korban Pesach, which is obviously a sheep, but it was left over, and it wasn't offered as a Korban Pesach, so you can offer it as a Shlamim, i.e. as a type of Korban which theoretically can be offered as a sheep or as a cow. For Abana, my time Lodachi Shabbos. Havadi Korban Tzibur. Now, how come the rabbi said that the Chagiga Yudalit is not Docha Shabbos? I mean, after all, it is a Korban Tzibur. Korban Tzibur is like the Talmud, for example, is Docha Shabbos. So Amar B'Ila Mishum Rabbi Yehuda ben Safra Amar Kra. So it says Rabbi Ila in the name of Rabbi Yehuda ben Safra that the pasuk says V'chagosim also Chag LaHashem Shivas Yom Bashana. That it says that the V'chagosim also, that it will be a Chag, i.e. like the Shami Chagiga will be Shivas Yom Bashana, will be for 7 days. Shiva Shmona Havu. Why only 7 days? Right? This is in the context of Sukkot. Now Sukkot is really 8 days, right? Shmini Atzeres also, and you could bring the Shalmei Chagiga from the first day of Sukkot until through Shmini Atzeres. So if that's the case, you really have 8 days to bring the Korban Chagiga. How come it says 7 days? So Ela Mikan Chagiga Shenedoche Es Shabbos. So we see that the Chagiga is Taka, not Doche Shabbos. Kiasar Ravin Amar Amar Tifnei Rabosai Pam Shei Atamotze El Shisha. So now Ravin came and he said, look, I said before my rabbis that there are times though when you actually can only bring the Chagiga for 6 days. For example, if the first day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbos, well then the first day of Sukkot is Shabbos, and also Shmini Atzeres is going to be Shabbos, and you really only have 6 days to bring the Chagiga. So Amar Abai, Oven Tichla Lema Ki Milsa. Interesting. So Abai says Oven Tichla. Tichla is like from Shichla, Shachul, somebody who lost their children. So Abai, so Ravin apparently lost his children in his lifetime. So says Abai, Oven Tichla Lema Ki Milsa. Wow, I'm so surprised that Oven the childless would say such a thing. Meaning, the drasha is that you don't bring a Korban Chagiga on Shabbos from the fact that we say that Chagiga is for 7 days. What do you mean? Shouldn't it be 8 days of Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres? Well, why is it 7? Because one day Mistama is going to be Shabbos, so therefore it's not really 8 days, it's only 7 days. Ravin says, what do you mean? But sometimes it could be even 6 days. So Abai says, Ma pitom, Shmona lo mishkachas laklal shiva isa b'rov shanim. It's never going to be 8 days, because assuming there's always going to be at least 1 day that is Shabbos, and therefore the Torah says, so you bring a Chagiga for 7 days, because 1 day is going to be Shabbos. Now, so it's never going to be 8 days, so we say 7 days, but most years it's going to be 7 days. We're not going to be worried about 6 days, because sometimes it'll be 6 days if the first day of Sukkot is Shabbos. But when it says 7, it's talking about the majority of years. It's going to be 7 days that you can bring the Korban Chagiga, because 1 day is going to be Shabbos. We're not concerned about the fact that, it's true that technically sometimes it'll only be 6 days. Okay, well, that was Daf Ayin, Daf 70 of Masechta Pesachim. Really, the main thing here was like the Korban Chagiga, right? Specifically for most of it, the Chagigas Yudalid, that the Chacham say that basically it's its own thing. First of all, what is the Chagigas Yudalid? Chagigas Yudalid is a korban that they would bring to supplement the meat of the Korban Pesach, to make sure that everyone had enough meat to eat, so that the Korban Pesach can be eaten after that, once everybody's full. So the Chacham say it's basically its own kind of offering. It's a regular shlamim. It can be 2 days and whatever the halachas are. But Ben Tema says that actually we really pretty much apply all of the halachas of the Korban Pesach to this hagiga Yudalid. The only outstanding question that we really had is regarding what about breaking the bones of the hagiga Yudalid. We wanted to say that Ben Tema would say that you're not allowed to break the bones of the hagiga Yudalid, just like the Korban Pesach, but we ended up saying that maybe we can't necessarily prove that. Alright, we also said that the hagiga Yudalid is Zafka, not Docha Shabbos, although we said at the end that really any Korban hagiga is not Doche Shabbos. Alright, there was a machlokas there between Chacham and Rabbi Yehuda ben Dortai. Rabbi Yehuda ben Dortai felt that really the hagiga should be Doche Shabbos, just like the Korban Pesach is Doche Shabbos, but the Chacham say that the hagiga is taka not Doche Shabbos from the fact that it says Chagosim Chag Lashem Shivas Yomim and not Shmonas Yomim by Sukkos. I hope you enjoyed that fine. Peace out.